Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. Please like this video and comment below. What would you have done if you were in that diner that morning? Your perspective matters, and I read every comment. The morning sun filtered through the plate glass windows of Myers' diner, casting geometric patterns across the worn linoleum floor. It was the kind of gentle light that made ordinary things look almost sacred: the chrome napkin dispensers, the red vinyl booth seats patched with duct tape, the faded menu board with its hand-painted breakfast specials. Dorothy Harmon sat in her regular corner booth, the one with a clear view of Maple Street's morning traffic. At 72, she'd developed rituals that anchored her days. The walk to Myers. The Earl Grey tea steeped exactly 3 minutes. The hour-long reading session with whatever novel her daughter had sent her. This morning it was a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, a woman Dorothy had long admired for her quiet, unshakable dignity. She adjusted her reading glasses, the tortoiseshell ones her late husband had helped her pick out, and turned another page. The diner hummed with its usual peaceful soundtrack, the sizzle of bacon on the griddle, the murmur of the morning news from the television mounted in the corner, the gentle clink of silverware against ceramic plates. Dorothy wore a pale lavender cardigan, soft and well-loved, over a simple floral dress. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun. There was something timeless about her appearance, a studied elegance that spoke of a generation that believed in presenting yourself properly to the world, even for a Tuesday morning breakfast. She took a sip of her tea, savoring the familiar warmth, and smiled softly at nothing in particular. These quiet moments were precious. Since Harold's death 3 years ago, she'd learned to find peace in solitude, to treasure the small ceremonies of her daily routine. The door's bell chimed, not the usual gentle jing. Low, but a violent, jarring clang that made several patrons look up in alarm. 3 young men burst through the entrance like a weather event, bringing with them a storm of noise and chaotic energy that immediately shattered the diner's tranquil atmosphere. The one in front was striking in an almost theatrical way. He had tousled auburn hair that fell artfully across his forehead, sharp cheekbones, and the kind of effortless good looks that had probably opened doors for him his entire life. He wore a maroon and white varsity jacket, the letter H prominently displayed on the chest, over a fitted gray t-shirt. Even his posture radiated a casual arrogance, the physical manifestation of someone who'd never been told no and meant it. His name was Brett Holloway, though Dorothy wouldn't learn that until later. His 2 companions, one stocky with a buzz cut, the other lanky with an oversized hoodie, followed in his wake like pilot fish trailing a shark. They were loud, performance loud, their laughter harsh and aggressive, designed to dominate the space they'd just entered. They threw themselves into the booth directly behind Dorothy with enough force to make the whole bench shudder. The volume of their conversation was assault, every word projected as if they were performing for an invisible audience. Dorothy flinched slightly but didn't turn around. She'd lived long enough to recognize the particular brand of young male bravado on display. Just ignore them, she told herself, focusing on her book. They'll settle down. But they didn't settle. If anything, their volume increased. Their conversation was a crude showcase of vulgar boasting, conquests, parties, people they'd humiliated. Each statement punctuated by fists slamming the table, making Dorothy's teacup rattle in its saucer. She tried to retreat into Eleanor Roosevelt's words, but concentration was impossible. The noise was a physical intrusion, polluting the sanctuary she'd built. Then Brett said something that cut through the diner's air like a knife through silk. It was a racial slur, vicious and ugly, aimed at no one and everyone. He said it casually, almost as punctuation to whatever crude story he was telling, but it landed on Dorothy's shoulders with the weight of history. The few other patrons, a retired couple at the counter, a young mother with a toddler in a high chair, a construction worker reading his paper, all went silent. Even the cook, visible through the pass-through window, paused mid-flip of a pancake. Dorothy set down her book carefully. She took a slow, deliberate breath, her hands trembling slightly. Then she turned her head, just enough to make eye contact with the booth behind her. Not a full confrontation. Just a look. A look that said, clearly and without words, asterisk, we all heard you. Have some decency, asterisk. That was all. Just a look. Brett caught it. His eyes, an icy blue that in another context might be called beautiful, locked onto hers. Something flickered across his handsome features. Not shame. Annoyance. How dare she? You got some kind of problem, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. He leaned around the edge of the booth, making sure everyone could see this interaction, turning it into another performance. Dorothy kept her voice steady and soft. I simply think everyone here would appreciate a quieter conversation, young man. For a moment, Brett just stared at her, processing this gentle rebuke. Then a slow, dangerous smirk spread across his face. He looked her up and down with deliberate slowness, the elderly woman, the modest clothes, the gentle dignity. He saw exactly what he wanted to see, an easy target, a prop for his show, someone so obviously beneath him that putting her in her place would cost him nothing. Oh, you think, do you? His voice rose, making sure his audience, his friends, the other patrons, were all paying attention. Let me tell you what I think. I think you need to mind your own damn business, you old. The word he used was ugly, ancient, a weapon designed specifically to wound and humiliate. It hung in the air like poison gas. Dorothy's face went pale. Not from fear, but from a profound, bone-deep weariness. How many times in her 72 years had she encountered this particular brand of hatred? Too many to count. But she'd never quite gotten used to it. There's no call for that kind of language, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Brett laughed, a harsh, barking sound devoid of genuine humor. He slid out of his booth and stood, towering over where she sat. His friends watched with frozen grins, caught between excitement and a dawning unease about where this was heading. I'll talk any damn way I want, Brett said, leaning over her table. You don't like it? What are you going to do about it, huh? If you're finding this story compelling, please take a moment to subscribe. What happens next in this quiet diner is something you absolutely need to see through to the end. The consequences of this moment will ripple further than anyone in that room could possibly imagine, asterisk. Brett Holloway had lived his entire 21 years in a bubble of privilege so complete it had become invisible to him. He was the son of Richard Holloway, a prominent real estate developer whose name appeared on buildings throughout the city. His mother, Catherine, was a former debutante who'd married well and spent her days on charity boards and country club committees. Brett had gone to the best private schools, played varsity lacrosse, joined the Wright fraternity at the State University. He was handsome, athletically built, and possessed the easy confidence of someone who'd never truly faced consequences for his actions. Minor infractions, the DUI when he was 17, the academic probation freshman year, the property damage at the frat house, had all been smoothed over with phone calls, donations, and well-connected lawyers. Last night had been typical, a fraternity party where he'd been the center of attention, too much alcohol, the intoxicating feeling of being invincible. The diner stop was meant to be a triumphant postscript, a place to sober up over greasy food before heading back to campus. When Dorothy had turned around, when she'd dared to correct him with that gentle, chiding tone, it was like a needle puncturing the balloon of his ego. In Brett's world, women like her were invisible, background characters, service workers, people who existed to make his life more comfortable. They certainly didn't correct him. They didn't look at him with disappointment. The outrage he felt was immediate and disproportionate. Who was she? The audacity of it. It was a challenge to the entire natural order of his universe. His friends, Tyler and Connor, were watching, waiting for his response. This was his audience, his validation. He couldn't back down. That would be weakness. So Brett did something he'd done perhaps dozens of times before in smaller, less visible ways. He asserted dominance. He put someone in their place. He raised his hand, not clenched in a fist, but open, contemptuous, and he slapped Dorothy Harmon across the face. The sound was a crack that seemed to stop time itself. It wasn't a punch meant for a fight. It was a gesture of pure disrespect, meant to humiliate, to demean, to remind this old woman that in the hierarchy of his world, she was nothing and he was everything. Dorothy's head snapped to the side. Her hand flew to her cheek, her eyes wide with a pain that was far more emotional than physical. The reading glasses tumbled from her face, clattering on the table. Tears welled up immediately, hot and shameful, though she fought to keep them from falling. She stared at the table's surface, at the pattern of fake marble grain, at anything but him. The world reduced itself to the sting on her skin and the crushing weight of injustice. After 72 years, after a lifetime of maintaining her dignity in the face of countless small cruelties, this man-child had reduced her to this, a trembling, violated woman in a public space, surrounded by witnesses who'd seen her humiliation. Brett stood there, breathing hard, a triumphant smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He'd done it. He'd shown her. He'd shown them all. He turned back toward his friends, expecting their approval, their laughter, their validation that he'd been right to put this uppity old woman in her place. But Tyler and Connor weren't smiling anymore. Their faces had gone pale, the earlier excitement replaced by something that looked a low tea-like fear. The diner was utterly, deathly silent. Maria, the waitress, a middle-aged woman who'd served Dorothy for nearly a decade, stood frozen behind the counter, one hand covering her mouth in horror. The retired couple at the counter sat rigid, the husband half risen from his stool, his weathered face a mask of barely controlled fury. Even the toddler in the highchair had gone quiet, sensing the terrible wrongness in the room. And Brett, riding high on his moment of triumph, didn't notice the man who'd just walked through the door. A man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, carrying a worn leather briefcase, who'd seen everything. The approach, the words, the raised hand, the slap, the tears. He stood frozen just inside the doorway, his entire world collapsing into a single, white-hot point of absolute fury. The woman shrinking into her lavender cardigan, trying to make herself invisible at that corner booth, was his mother. And the man in the suit was Federal Judge David Harmon of the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. David Harmon's morning had begun in bureaucratic frustration. An early meeting with fellow judges about an upcoming panel review had run long, made tedious by procedural debates that seemed to multiply rather than resolve. He'd texted his mother around 8 a.m., meetings dragging. Might escape for coffee at Myers if you're there. Need to see a friendly face. She'd replied with a simple heart emoji and, I'll be in my usual spot. Myers' Diner held decades of memories for David. He'd come here as a child with his parents, his father, a postal worker with an unshakable moral compass, his mother, an elementary school teacher who believed in the fundamental goodness of people. They'd celebrated David's acceptance to law school in this very diner, toasting with coffee and apple pie. His father had died of a sudden heart attack 8 years ago, but his mother had kept the tradition alive, maintaining her weekly visits with religious devotion. David had spent his entire career in service to the law. He'd been a civil rights attorney, a federal prosecutor, and for the past 5 years, an appellate judge. He'd presided over cases involving constitutional questions, civil liberties, and the most complex corners of federal jurisprudence. He'd cultivated a reputation for unshakable calm, for measured analysis, for treating even the most inflammatory cases with cool, dispassionate reason. All of that training, all of that professional discipline, evaporated in the space of a heartbeat. He'd pushed through the diner's door just in time to see a young man in a varsity jacket raise his hand and strike his 72-year-old mother across the face. For a moment, perhaps 2 seconds that stretched into eternity, David's mind went completely blank. Then it flooded with a primal, atavistic rage so pure and overwhelming it threatened to obliterate every civilized instinct he possessed. Every neuron in his body screamed a single command, eliminate the threat. Protect her. Now, He didn't run. He didn't shout. But he moved with a speed and purpose that was terrifying in its controlled intensity. 6 long strides across the checkered floor. He set his briefcase down on the empty seat across from his mother with deliberate, ominous care, a simple gesture that somehow announced his presence more effectively than any words could have. Brett, finally sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere, turned away from his booth. He saw a well-dressed black man, mid-40s, standing near the old woman. Another problem. Another person who didn't know their place. "What's your issue, man?" Brett said, puffing out his chest, the varsity jacket seeming to inflate around him. "This is a private conversation." David didn't even look at him. Not yet. He knelt beside his mother's booth, his back to Brett, creating a physical wall between them. When he spoke, his voice was so soft it was almost inaudible to anyone more than a few feet away. "Mom. Look at me." Dorothy slowly raised her head. When her eyes met her son's, the dam broke. The tears she'd been desperately holding back spilled over, tracking down her weathered cheeks. Seeing him, her brilliant, serious boy, the pride of her life, shattered the last of her composure. A small, wounded sound escaped her throat. David felt something crack cleanly in his chest. He took her hand, carefully avoiding her reddening cheek. "Are you hurt? Beyond this?" She shook her head, unable to speak, but her grip on his hand was desperate, crushing, telling him everything he needed to know about her terror and relief. "Okay," he whispered. "I'm here now. You're safe. I promise you're safe." He said it like a judicial decree, like a fact he would personally will into existence. Behind him, Brett's patience, already thin, evaporated. The man was ignoring him. Him. Brett Holloway. The silence in the diner was accusing, uncomfortable, and he needed to fill it, to regain control of the narrative. "Hey, I'm talking to you." His voice rose, brittle with false bravado. She started it, sticking her nose where it doesn't belong. Old bitch got exactly what she deserved. At the words, "what she deserved," David Harmon stood up and turned around. Brett found himself looking into a face that made his bravado falter for the first time. This wasn't an angry bystander. This was something else entirely. The eyes were dark, deep, and utterly still, like looking into a well that went down for miles. There was no shouting, no visible fury. Just a calm so absolute and terrifying it made the hair on the back of Brett's neck stand up. This was not a man who would throw a punch. This was a man who could dismantle a life with a word. "What is your name?" David's voice was quiet, level, and carried the weight of a gavel falling on polished wood. Brett scoffed, trying to resurrect his confidence. "What's it to you? Your name." The volume didn't change, but something in the air pressure dropped. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to quiet. Something in that voice, in the absolute lack of fear or aggression, finally pierced Brett's armor of entitlement. This wasn't following the usual script. His gut twisted with the first real tendril. Unease. Brett. Brett Holloway. David gave a single, slow nod, as if filing the information in some mental ledger. "You have just committed assault on Dorothy Harmon in front of multiple witnesses. You will sit down in that booth. You will not move. You will not speak. You will wait." Brett laughed, but it was a nervous sound that cracked in the middle. "Or what? You gonna call the cops?" "Go ahead, man. My dad's lawyer will have me out before lunch." It was a line he'd used before, a charm that had always worked, a trump card that smoothed over all his troubles. For the first time, something other than fury touched David's expression, a flicker of cold, almost pitying recognition. He'd seen this type before, the entitled young man for whom consequences were always abstract, always negotiable, always for other people. David reached into his inner jacket pocket. Not for a phone, but for a small leather credential wallet, worn at the edges from years of use. He flipped it open, holding it up so Brett and his pale-faced friends could see the gold federal shield and the identification card behind clear plastic. "I am not calling the police, Mr. Holloway," Judge David Harmon said, each syllable measured and precise. "I am a United States Circuit Judge. You are now a subject of federal interest. Sit down." The words fell into the silent diner with the force of a physical blow. United States Federal Judge. These were words from a different universe than the one Brett inhabited, a world where his father's money and connections meant nothing, where a varsity jacket was just fabric, where real, inescapable consequences lived. The color drained from Brett's face like water from a broken vessel. His legs seemed to give out, and he sat down heavily, as if the strings holding him up had been cut. He blinked, looking from the federal credential to the implacable face holding it, then to the elderly woman, a judge's mother, oh God, and finally to his friends, who looked like they wanted to melt into the vinyl seats and disappear entirely. Tyler had his face in his hands. Connor stared straight ahead, rigid as a statue. The script Brett knew, bluster, threats, my dad's lawyer, had no lines for this. There was no scene where the federal judge showed up before the cops. This was a complete narrative rupture, a crack in reality itself. David turned his attention to the room at large. When he spoke again, his tone shifted to something formal, procedural, carrying the authority of the bench. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disruption. This establishment is now the scene of a federal assault investigation. I must ask you all to remain briefly to provide witness statements. Your cooperation is appreciated." It wasn't a request. It was a judicial order, delivered with steel courtesy that made it utterly immutable. He looked at Maria, his expression softening by a degree. "Ma'am, would you please bring my mother a glass of water and—" The shift in his tone, from federal judge to devoted son, was subtle but profound. Maria jumped into action, nodding mutely, her hands trembling as she filled a glass and grabbed a clean towel. David finally took out his phone. He didn't dial 911. He scrolled through his contacts to a direct number, Frank Morrison, chief of the local U.S. Marshal Service, a man he knew professionally and trusted completely. "Frank, it's David Harmon. I have a situation requiring immediate federal attention." A pause. Myers Diner on Maple Street. Assault on a senior citizen, racially motivated language, witnessed by multiple parties. Perpetrator is detained and identified. I need a team, quietly, and local PD for crowd management. Yes, my mother is the victim. He listened for a moment, his eyes never leaving Brett, who had begun to tremble visibly. Thank you, Frank. He ended the call and took the seat opposite his mother, reaching across to hold both her hands. The rest of the diner, the stunned patrons, the trembling young men, receded into a blur. For this moment, there were only two people in the universe. Tell me everything, Mom. From the beginning. Take your time. And Dorothy, in a halting but clear voice, began to recount it all. The response was swift and overwhelming, a demonstration of the vast difference between local disorder and federal attention. Two uniformed local police officers arrived first, alerted by the Marshal Service. They were brief, professional, a study in calm efficiency. They spoke quietly with Judge Harmon, then secured the perimeter, standing at the door and taking preliminary information from patrons. They looked at Brett with detached, procedural coldness. He wasn't a person to them, just a problem to be contained and transferred. Then the federal agents arrived. Two U.S. Marshals in dark windbreakers emblazoned with gold letters, U.S. Marshal. They moved with economical purpose, speaking first to Judge Harmon in a quiet, respect. Full conference near the entrance. Then one, a tall man with close-cropped graying hair, approached Brett's booth. Brett Holloway. Stand up, please. Place your hands on the table. The procedure was calm, utterly devoid of anger or malice, and somehow that made it infinitely more terrifying. Brett stood on weak legs. He placed his hands flat on the formica, the surface cool against his sweating palms. The marshal moved behind him. You are under arrest for assault. You have the right to remain silent. The Miranda rights, words Brett had only ever heard on television, washed over him. Each one a lock clicking shut. Terms like assault on a protected person and potential hate crime enhancement were used, clinical, procedural words that transformed his stupid impulse into a category of federal offense. They weren't rough with him as they guided his hands behind his back, but their touch was impersonal and firm. The cold metal of the handcuffs closing around his wrists was the most real sensation Brett had ever experienced. The twin clicks echoed in the absolute silence like the closing of a tomb. As he was led past the other booths toward the door, he chanced a look at Dorothy and David. Dorothy was watching him. Not with fear or even anger, but with a deep, weary, almost maternal sadness for the waste, for the trajectory of a young life about to be destroyed by a moment of thoughtless cruelty. David wasn't looking at him at all. He was speaking to the other marshal, pointing toward a small security camera mounted above the register. Brett wasn't a person anymore. He was evidence. A case file. A docket number waiting to be assigned. Outside, the morning sun was blindingly, impossibly normal. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the police cars and unmarked federal sedan. They watched as a young man in a bright varsity jacket, head bowed, was placed in the back of a government vehicle. Phones rose. Recording began. The digital age's judgment had already started. Inside, David helped his mother to her feet. "Let's get you home, Mom." "My book," she said softly, clinging to the normal detail. "I have it." He tucked the L. Eleanor Roosevelt biography under his arm, retrieved his briefcase, and guided her toward the door, his body positioned protectively between her and the gathering crowd outside. In the car, the silence was thick and pressurized. Dorothy stared out the window at the familiar neighborhood passing by in a blur. Finally, she spoke, her voice small in the quiet space. "I'm sorry, David." He glanced at her, pained. "Sorry? Mom, you have nothing. I caused a scene. I disrupted your day. Now you're involved in this mess. It'll be in the papers. Your position." He pulled over to the side of a quiet, tree-lined street. Turned to her, his judicial mask completely gone, replaced by the face of her heartbroken son. "You did not cause this. That young man caused this. You were reading a book. That's all. The fact that he thought he could violate your peace, your person, that's the mess. Not you. Never you." He reached over and cupped her uninjured cheek. "You are the most decent person I know. This is on him. And the world is about to explain that to him in very clear terms." He saw it then, the shame she was carrying, the internalized weight of a lifetime of being told to be quiet, to not make trouble, to swallow indignities for the sake of peace. "We're going home. You're going to rest. And then we're going to see this through. Not with anger, Mom, with the law. The same law that protects everyone. Especially you." The story spread through the city's digital veins like wildfire. By noon, it was a headline: "Varsity athlete assaults elderly woman, faces federal hate crime charges." The details were sparse but explosive: racial slur, elderly victim, federal judge's mother. By evening it was trending. A perfect storm of optics, modern privilege meeting the iron wall of justice, with a dramatic twist of poetic irony. In a sterile holding cell at the federal building, Brett Holloway experienced true solitude for the first time in his life. The bravado, the friends, the jacket, the phone, the imagined shield of his father's influence, all gone. He was given his one phone call. With numb fingers, he dialed his father's office. The conversation was not what he expected. After Brett's choked, rambling explanation, there was a long silence. So profound Brett thought the call had dropped. "A federal judge," his father finally said, his voice flat with a horror Brett had never heard before. "You struck the mother of a federal judge. In public. And you used that language." The disappointment was a physical force through the receiver. "Dad, she was disrespecting me, and—" "Stop talking," Richard Holloway interrupted, his voice tight and controlled. "Do not say another word to anyone. Not guards, not cellmates, no one. I'm calling our attorney right now. But understand this, son, this is not a speeding ticket. This is potentially career-ending before your career even begins. And given the publicity, potentially very damaging for me as well." The call ended with a dull click that sounded to Brett like a door slamming shut on his future. "Would you like me to continue with the remaining sections?" At the Harmon household, a different kind of gravity settled over the rooms. The cozy, book-filled home felt both like a refuge and a command center. Dorothy was resting in her sitting room, a soft crocheted blanket over her legs, while her dear friend from church, Patricia, sat beside her. They spoke in low tones about faith, endurance, and the hymns they'd sung together for 40 years. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. Please like this video and comment below. What would you have done if you were in that diner that morning? Your perspective matters, and I read every comment. The morning sun filtered through the plate glass windows of Meyer's Diner, casting geometric patterns across the worn linoleum floor. It was the kind of gentle light that made ordinary things look almost sacred: the chrome napkin dispensers, the red vinyl booth seats patched with duct tape, the faded menu board with its hand-painted breakfast specials. Dorothy Harmon sat in her regular corner booth, the one with a clear view of Maple Street's morning traffic. At 72, she'd developed rituals that anchored her days. The walk to Meyer's. The Earl Grey tea steeped exactly 3 minutes. The hour-long reading session with whatever novel her daughter had sent her. This morning it was a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, a woman Dorothy had long admired for her quiet, unshakable dignity. She adjusted her reading glasses, the tortoiseshell ones her late husband had helped her pick out, and turned another page. The diner hummed with its usual peaceful soundtrack, the sizzle of bacon on the griddle, the murmur of the morning news from the television mounted in the corner, the gentle clink of silverware against ceramic plates. Dorothy wore a pale lavender cardigan, soft and well-loved, over a simple floral dress. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun. There was something timeless about her appearance, a studied elegance that spoke of a generation that believed in presenting yourself properly to the world, even for a Tuesday morning breakfast. She took a sip of her tea, savoring the familiar warmth, and smiled softly at nothing in particular. These quiet moments were precious. Since Harold's death 3 years ago, she'd learned to find peace in solitude, to treasure the small ceremonies of her daily routine. The door's bell chimed, not the usual gentle gle, but a violent, jarring clang that made several patrons look up in alarm. 3 young men burst through the entrance like a weather event, bringing with them a storm of noise and chaotic energy that immediately shattered the diner's tranquil atmosphere. The one in front was striking in an almost theatrical way. He had tousled auburn hair that fell artfully across his forehead, sharp cheekbones, and the kind of effortless good looks that had probably opened doors for him his entire life. He wore a maroon and white varsity jacket, the letter H prominently displayed on the chest, over a fitted gray t-shirt. Even his posture radiated a casual arrogance, the physical manifestation of someone who'd never been told no and meant it. His name was Brett Holloway, though Dorothy wouldn't learn that until later. His 2 companions, one stocky with a buzz cut, the other lanky with an oversized hoodie, followed in his wake like pilot fish trailing a shark. They were loud, performance loud.